Here's what I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to talk about something that I'm calling the fear of the African population growth. But we started out talking about something else, which I think is extremely important. I woke up this morning and heard that the statue of Columbus in Baltimore had been pulled down, and that this statue was not only just pulled down, it was thrown into the harbor. People, they tore it down and they put it into the harbor. And I said, this is it's a remarkable kind of thing, because what it demonstrates to me, by them being able, by the young people, and many of them were young people, very young people, pulling it down, that people understood that Columbus really was a murderer. And people forget things like that. His people, when they came to the Caribbean, they raped the Arawak and Taino women, and they murdered many of the heads of the clans of these people. And he wrote about this in his diary. That's how we know about it. He wrote about how gentle the people were. Columbus said that the people did not even have, they didn't even understand the notion of weapons. That when they took his sword, they cut their hands with the sword because they took the wrong part of it. They took the blade. And so and then of course, what happened was, because they showed that what to the whites from Europe as weakness, they were slaughtered. And that's a sad lesson. So what we've got to learn, and I think that we're learning it more and more, is that the arrogance that comes with the assertions of Europe sometimes also comes with ignorance. That they're ignorant, but it's not just ignorant. There are people who do not see other people as humans, and so the lack of humanity of others is a problem that sits at the very door of the Western civilization. And in this country, the U.S., which in many respects is the beast that has been given birth to by Europe, and particularly by the United Kingdom, really is a major problem in the world. And I mean, when you saw the other day when Trump went to the sacred lands of the Lakota people, and stood in that valley and gave a speech and then raised his fist like some conqueror, you understand the nature of his mentality, which is to ride roughshod over other people. So that's the context for my discourse with you today, my discussion with you about this question of population, because and I call it the fear of the African population growth, because increasingly now I'm reading articles, and I'm seeing articles where people are saying, well, the world is overpopulated and there are too many people, and Africa is growing too much, and there are too many people in Africa, and that's why there's starvation and so forth, and there's starvation in Asia, and all of this is because the population is growing too much. Well, I want us to analyze all of this today and have some understanding of what really is going on. Uh, the Earth has 7.8 billion people. That's almost 8 billion human beings that live on this planet. And the planet is growing in terms of population. When you think of the first humans, Homo sapiens, that rose in East Africa as a very small group of people, and then populated the continent of Africa, and then populated outside of the continent of Africa by traveling out of Africa, and that before 70,000 years ago, everybody in the world was black, because that was the nature of the origin of humanity. Human beings originated in Africa, and human beings left and went from the eastern part of Africa throughout the rest of Africa, and then crossed over into Europe and into Asia. That's what science tells us, right? And that's what DNA tells us as well. It's not just archaeological science; it is also a biological science. So there's 7.8 or nearly 8 billion people on the earth today. And we're growing at about 83 million people a year. And as far as we know, right now, I mean, certainly human beings are trying to discover whether or not there are other people in the universe. But as far as we know, the Earth is the only astronomical object with human life. I'm a person who believes in rational thinking, and I can imagine that out of the trillion planets that are out there, that there must be human life or life somewhere else. But we don't know that. We have not seen that. We have not yet found life anywhere else. So it is very hard for us, given where we are here on this earth, to say what is out there other than speculation. So I've said this before in one of the other lectures, that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. And hominins, that is human-like creatures, were discovered about 7.2 years ago, at least in terms of skeletal remains that show us how old human skeletons are. And the oldest skeletal remain was found in Chad, which is a country in central North Africa. And that is the Sahelanthropus, they call us Sahelanthropus chadensis, meaning from Chad, from the Chad region, 7.2. And this is older than Dinknesh that we heard about once before. The Dinknesh was the skeletal remains in Ethiopia that they discovered and named Lucy. You know how Europeans will do it. Americans, they find something, they're gonna give them an American name. Even black people, they give American names to, or European names, English names. So they found this skeleton remains of the hominin in Ethiopia, and they called her Lucy. Well, of course, the Ethiopians objected. They said, she should have this figure, this object should have an African name. So they called her Dinknesh. So Homo sapiens, and now Dinknesh and Sahelanthropus chadensis were not humans. They were not humans. They were hominids. They were on the track to become humans. But we don't get the first appearance of Homo sapiens, and in fact, the first anatomically human figure until around 300,000 years ago. And that 300,000 years ago, I mean, this is research that was done both at the archaeological level and later on in the 1980s at the biological level of the study of what is called mitochondrial DNA, that we get a pretty close understanding that the first Homo sapiens, that is the first humans with knowledge, rose about 300,000 years ago in East Africa. So we know that, all right? So after 300,000 years, when all of us who are living here, the 8 billion, nearly 8 billion people on the earth, all of us have more than 99% the same genetic material. We all basically the same. So if I could ask you, as someone who is not muted, if you could please mute your computer, it would help us a lot, okay? Because I hear you in the background. So, but the thing is that what happened is that if you understand that all of us have the same DNA, then you understand that this one African woman is the mother of us all. That there is, that the African mother is at the very beginning of 8 billion people. There's no, the, all science points that way. There's no argument. You can't even argue it. Yeah, in fact, they try. Some people have tried many ways to get at this, to argue. Well, maybe it can't be just out of Africa. Maybe human beings started in many different places throughout the world. But that's not true. There's been nobody to even show or demonstrate that human beings came into being from any other place other than the continent of Africa. That we are ourselves at the very heart and center, that Africa is the very heart and center of humanity. So what is happening now? American and European scientists are claiming the earth is overpopulated. They mean that the earth cannot be sustained this is what they mean by overpopulation. Uh, that if you take the population of the earth, it cannot be sustained with the resources that are required for every person. And you just cannot give every person all the resources, for example, that an American has in his or her lifestyle. You can't give that to everybody in the world. Somebody is going to have to starve. It cannot be. So they're saying that that it's overpopulated because you're going to have death by starvation, and when you start having death by starvation, which balances the birth rate, it means that the earth has reached the capacity of the earth to sustain human beings. All of us. Now, this is interesting when you start thinking about this, because if you just talk about the numbers, 8 billion people, 8 billion people, all of us could fit in the state of Texas. The whole world can fit in the state of Texas. 8 billion people. Texas could hold 8 billion people. So it's not the numbers per se, it's the numbers using the resources of the earth, you see? So this is a very interesting time for us not to be engaged in this discussion and not to be aware of what plans or what ideas people have. Look at this. By 2050, that's about 30 years from now, India will overtake, and we know this by looking at the birth rates. India will overtake China, and India will become the most populous nation in the world. China will be number 2. But guess who will be number 3? Nigeria. Nigeria will be the 3rd most populous nation in the world after India and China by 2050. That's like 30 years from now, you see? Now, this is interesting because nobody ever conceived 50 years ago that we would have to deal with a situation where African nations will be growing at such a rapid rate. And since Nigeria will be number 3 in the world in 30 years, people are now looking at the Nigerian population because Nigeria is growing at a rate of 3.2 a year. And so if you say that Nigeria sustains this rate, it will have over 400 million people in 2050. And today, Nigeria has 220 million people. Just by comparison, the United States population is about 340 million. So the US has a big population, 340 million now, but but Nigeria will overtake the United States in the next 30 years. That is what people are claiming. That this 220 million in Nigeria will overtake the population of the United States, which will be declining because, and it will decline even more if there's no immigration. You see, if the United States stops immigration, it will decline in a more rapid pace. And the reason for this is because the population of Nigeria is younger. It's about 19 years of age. It's the average age. So 19 or 20 years of age, average age for Nigeria, and it must be around 40 or 42 for the United States. There's no competition. There is going to be many more people in Nigeria than are in the United States of America. But now that's not the whole story about Africa, because Nigeria is not even the fastest growing nation in Africa, even though it's growing faster than any other country in Europe or in North America or in Asia. It's still not the fastest growing in Africa. The fastest growing nation in Africa, and I looked at this for this lecture today, is a country called Niger, Niger. It's a Niger. And then it struck me, something happened in Niger. You remember about a year, maybe was it a year, 2 years ago? Not long ago, maybe it may have been a little longer than that in terms of my memory, but you remember the American soldiers who were in Niger, and a black soldier. This is during the Trump administration. A black soldier was killed and left on the battlefield by his white comrades. And this was a big problem. You remember the sister who was a congresswoman down in Florida? She spoke about this. You remember General Kelly, who was working for Trump at the time, got up and lied about what she said and what was said and what didn't happen and so on. You may not remember it, but it happened. And then so when I study and find out that Niger, with 48 births per 1,000 people per year, is growing at 3.8. It is the highest percentage of growth of population in the world today. Is going on right now in the country of Niger. And most of us have never heard of Niger. This is not Nigeria. Niger is north of Nigeria. And it's not a major country in terms of population. It's mostly desert, probably 20 million people that live there. But now, in terms of just having children, I mean, the average woman has 7 children in Niger. So Niger is just boom, is just growing. So it's a very interesting thing to watch. Now, of course, Asia takes the population cake in this sense that China has 1.37, maybe 1 billion 400 million people. It's almost, if you say China, I would round it off and say China has like 1.5 billion people, and India has 1.3 billion. But eventually, as I pointed out to you, given the statistics, the death rate and the birth rate, India will surpass China. But right now in Asia, another big country is Indonesia. We don't talk about Indonesia much, but Indonesia is really 255 million people. 255 million puts Indonesia right now ahead of Nigeria and puts Indonesia very close to the United States. And then, of course, you got Pakistan with 191 million, Bangladesh with 158 million, Japan 126 million, and so forth and so on. So Asia you got these huge countries with many, many people in them. Now just compare that with Europe. The European nations, you have, like, even if you take Russia, which is the biggest population in Europe, you only have 144 million. You got 144 million in Russia, which is the largest country in Europe if you take it as a European country. And 144 million, that puts Russia between Japan and Bangladesh. In fact, Russia doesn't have as many people as Bangladesh. And most people don't even know where Bangladesh is. But it has nearly 160 million people. Russia only has 144. No other country in Europe has 100 million people. Even Germany, as populous as Germany is, it only has 82 million people. And if we take Turkey as also a European nation, Turkey has 81 million. Some people say, well, what about the United Kingdom? It was a big empire. Well, the United Kingdom is around 66 million people, maybe 70 million in the UK, 70 million in the UK, and 70 million. You see, that's not nearly as many as in Nigeria. When we're talking 220 million, even Russia is not as populate as has as many people as Nigeria. You see, Nigeria has 220 something million, and Russia has 144. France has about 65 million. And then you get Italy with 59 million, and maybe Spain with 46 million. So what you are doing here with these is you're just seeing that if you go down to 46 million people in Spain, then you got to ask yourself the question: how big is Africa? And I'm going to give you some populations in Africa that are larger than I mean, I'm gonna start larger than Spain, so that you can see relatively what the real problem is for Europe. That actually, Algeria in Africa has Spain. Remember this: Spain has 46 million, and Algeria has 50 million. So Algeria has more people, and it's mostly desert, but Algeria has more people than Spain. Kenya, Kenya has 52 million people, you see? And Kenya, with its 52 million people, it shows you that with its 52 million people, it's about the size of Italy, you see? And then South Africa has 66 million people. That's about the size of the United Kingdom and the size of France. 66 million people in South Africa. But South Africa is not larger than Tanzania. Tanzania has 67 million people. That's a lot of people. But Tanzania is not as large as the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a country that has 95 million people. And those 95 million people would, if Democratic Republic of Congo was in Europe, it would be the second most populous nation in Europe after Russia, because that means that the Democratic Republic of Congo is larger than Germany in its population, and is only next to Russia in terms of European populations. And then after the Democratic Republic rather just above Democratic Republic of the Congo is Egypt, with 102 million people. Just that strip of land on both sides of the Nile River, running all the way from the south to the Mediterranean, where in the Delta area, where it goes out into fingers into the Mediterranean. But then, larger than Egypt, is Ethiopia. Ethiopia with 120 million souls. 120. Now, I've been in Ethiopia recently, and Ethiopia is really, I mean, there are people everywhere in that country, and it is growing rapidly. And so Ethiopia is really uh, almost as fast as Nigeria in terms of population expansion. Nigeria, of course, takes the cake. 220. Some people have even said 235 million people in Nigeria. Now, I give you this because of the legacy of this whole question of population. Europe has always been worried about population. That is why, even during the enslavement, the colonization, all of these things, Europe was worried about population, particularly when you create this notion of hierarchy of races and you create the notion uh, uh, that that Charles Darwin created with his book *The Origin of Species*, uh, or as he said, the subtitle, "The Preservation of the Favored Races." You can see that what Europe is very much concerned about population. Is it, are we going to be inundated by these Africans? Are we going to be inundated by these Chinese? I mean, this is a big question. Are we going to be inundated by the Indians? This is a major concern, not of any other scientists. I don't see scientists in Africa. I've been to the universities in Africa. They're not studying this. That's not a big issue. In Africa, if you fly around Africa, you can know there doesn't seem to be a population problem in Africa, even though it's heavily populated. You don't see. I mean, you could put the 8 billion people, just in South Africa. You can drop them in South Africa. So Africa is not overpopulated in terms of the numbers of people, right? But look at this. Right now, and this is what I learned from looking at 13th Amendment, more blacks are enslaved in the prison system in America than were enslaved in 1850 because of incarceration. Incarceration means, of course, that you can be, excuse me, somebody is doing, hello, 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 can I, I'm going to mute all. I'm going to have to do this to mute all. I'm going to mute everybody. All right? Yeah, because there was a noise going on. I couldn't. I was hearing it, and
Dr.
they couldn't hear.
Asante, if you want, you can make me your co-host, and I can mute people for you if noise pops up.
Okay, who is this?
This is Brother Omawale speaking.
Okay, Brother Omawale, I didn't even. Okay, let me find your name. And I'll be very happy to do that. But I think I can mute all right here though. But obviously you're not muted. so let me check, and I'll do this. But I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was just hearing some banging.
Yes, please mute us there.
Pardon?
Mute.
Mute
everybody.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Mute everybody.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. All right. So we'll mute all. All right. So the interesting thing is that this is a very, very, deep thing, particularly with incarceration, because 6% of the population of the American country is black, are black males, and yet 40% of the people in prison are black males. Now, we all know this whole history that the police were actually developed to chase black people, particularly those who had run away from enslavement or those who had been caught, had been running away without paperwork or going from between plantations and so on. And the whole idea was not only to strip us of our freedom, but to suppress us and to suppress our lives. And that's what people don't get. And that's why today, when I heard about the brothers in Stone Mountain, Georgia, where they armed themselves and went up to Stone Mountain, Georgia, hundreds of brothers with guns, I said, now, for the first time, this is a very interesting situation in the United States of America, because black people have been the most peaceful people in the world. You haven't had no terrorist activities going on for generations in America with African Americans, because we have always had this idea that we could make this a more perfect, more ethical, more moral society. But yet the criminalization of blacks in the attempt to imprison us, to deny our citizenship, our right to vote, the rhetoric of race, which has operated in America, has meant to depopulate black people. And this was the idea from the beginning with enslavement, was to work black people to death. They even had economic studies to study whether or not it was better to keep us enslaved for 20 years or for 7. If they could work us hard for 7 years, would they get enough benefit that they wouldn't have to feed us for 20? So the idea, the whole development of what we call professional economics in America, almost all the sciences, social sciences in America were developed around race. That's the whole thing. There's no other discussion. The discussion was, what is the cost benefit analysis if you're going to have an enslaved person? How hard should you work her? How many children should she bear? How can you manage to run your plantation if you don't have enough money to purchase additional enslaved people and so on? This was how economics developed. I'll show you a little later that that's how some medical fields developed as well. Between 1865, so they were trying to work as a death, but between 1865, end of the enslavement, to 1940, there were fierce attacks on black people in cities and towns throughout this country. There need to be many more stories and books written about this. People need to do dissertations just on some of these individual massacres. We know about Tulsa, and we talk about Tulsa, but we probably haven't, we still haven't even exhausted Tulsa in terms of writing about it and researching and asking questions about it. But we need to look at Memphis, New Orleans, St. Louis. Many, many cities and towns in which our people were massacred and murdered, you see. But we haven't done that because it's a conversation that black people have basically said, you know what, maybe we can go along and get along, or get along and go along. And perhaps ultimately people will come to light. And I think that part of what is happening, I hope, at least, this is the optimism of the African, I guess, that there is a sense that, hey, this history needs to be righted. And if we could write this history, if we could upset these statues of these slave holders, these rapists of black and African women in the plantations and in the kitchens, if we could just stop, if we could understand that, and if we not only can understand it, but if we can begin to say what kind of amends need to be made, and do that honestly, we can perhaps create a better social contract between Africans and whites, because we never had a social contract anyway that we participated in. It was always a social contract between white men, basically, not even the white women. It was white men had this social contract. And that social contract allowed them to do so many immoral, unethical things to black people, to women, to native people, to Asian people. The Chinese Exclusion Act. Most people have never heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act. which was terrible. It was a way for white people to take away the gold mines that Chinese had discovered in the West. It was a way for them to rip them of their property, you see. It's the same thing with the incarceration of the Japanese during World War II. They didn't go around arresting all the Germans in America and putting them in concentration camps. But they did put the Japanese in concentration camps. What did they do by doing that? They took away their stores, they took away their farms, they took away their houses, they stripped them away from it, you see. So there's an evil spirit, there's a mean spiritedness to this that has to be dealt with in the white population. And I always tell people, I think as white people need to retrain their children and themselves. It's not for black. We can't do that for them. That's what they have to do. Their so-called spiritual leaders have to spiritually lead. But the thing is that many times the spiritual leaders are the ones who are leading toward the evil. So it's a very, very difficult situation, you see. So the war against black people, mass incarceration, this whole thing that the Clintons started and Nixon, this whole thing, the war on drugs, you see, law and order. And they knew all the time that they were lying about drug possession on the part of black people. And then they instituted something, a law in America called 3 strikes and you out. And you get life, mandatory sentences for life. And the fact is that blacks in the cities threatened the idea of fair competition. And whites went on, I call it a new playbook, but it's an old playbook of reframing the question, reframing the situation. And our good friend Bill Clinton, in 1994, that crime bill created prisons for 100,000 people and added 100,000 police to the police forces in this nation. That was one of the biggest moments for undermining the African people, our lives, to sort of depopulating us, to control of black men, especially this notion that Hillary Clinton, and one of the reasons why she lost, this notion of super predators, taking the man or the woman out of the family equation. So you don't, I mean, you can't populate if you're in prison, and children are being raised without parents, and homes are broken up because of the poverty when you have one parent missing and so forth. So all of these things this is like population control. And there is a group that's called the American Legislative Exchange Council. It is one of the biggest Republican and corporate groups that operates in support of actually minimizing the rights of African people. And right now, it's probably operating to ensure that you're going to have a suppression of black votes. But what they end up doing is creating laws that they give to the Republicans to pass in the state legislatures. They're very much hand in hand with the Republican state legislators. For example, a law like the Stand Your Ground law. That Stand Your Ground law was not written by legislators. It was passed by legislators, but it was written by the American Legislative Exchange Council. And that Exchange Council is comprised of a lot of corporations in America. They tell them, we need this law. And those people, they go and they create that law. That's that law that Zimmerman said that he used when he killed Trayvon Martin. When he murdered Trayvon Martin, he said he used a law of, I was standing my ground. Well, really, it should have been Martin, who was standing his ground. But at any rate, I'm just telling you that almost every sector of society, everything that we do, every activity in this society has been colored and directed by this notion of how to punish African people and to hold African people back. Much see, the intent was much like they did with the native peoples. Remember this: there were 12 million native people here when Columbus came to the Caribbean, in the Caribbean and in North America. 12 million. But by the year 1880, there were only 250,000. So what did they do? What happened to those people? They were killed. They were actually murdered. I mean, and this is so sad that we sometimes don't know. We certainly we try to know our history, but we also, as John Henry Clark used to say, we need to know their history too, because they know their history, even though they don't like to tell people what their history was. Their history was that when they went to the west of this country, they gave the people blankets with smallpox. They gave the Native Americans, okay, we're going to put you on a plantation. We're taking you from your home. We're going to put you on a reservation, and you're going to be on this reservation. And the people say, well, we're cold because you killed all the buffalo. And that's what they did. You heard of Sherman, General Sherman? General Sherman, we used to laugh because as African Americans, we say, well, yeah, Sherman was one of the great generals of the United States who went through Georgia, making sure that he would destroy all of the resources that the Confederacy would have. And he marched from Atlanta to Savannah. And in fact, they named a tank after him called the Sherman tank. Well, what did he do when he went to deal with the Native Americans? They killed all the buffalo they could find in Colorado and those states out west to destroy the livelihood of the Native Americans whose lives depended upon the buffalo itself. They could use the skin and the meat and all the horn. They could use every part of the buffalo. That was the life of the Native American in the West. And the white people said, we kill all the buffalo. We don't have, we kill as many Native Americans as we want to, but we will kill all the buffalo. So if we kill all the buffalo, then then bring our cows in, then they have no livelihood because their livelihood is based on the buffalo. And so then when their livelihoods are based on the buffalo, then the question is, how do they get winter clothing? And then you give them blankets filled with smallpox and they die of smallpox. That's what happened to the Native Americans. Let me go quickly here and just tell you a little bit more about this thing with the population, and then I'll be finished. One of our outstanding graduates, alum, Catherine Kemi Bankole Medina wrote a book on slave medicine, and she alerted us to the dangers of racist medicine. And she's maybe one of the major people in this country right now in terms of slavery and medicine. What happened to black women and black men during the period of enslavement. But look at this. By, let's say this, 1865, from 1865 to around 1900, coming out of the enslavement, most of the people who were doing medical work were African people. Now, most people don't realize that. It was black people doing medicine. Even during the enslavement, you had black people doing medicine for each other. People would go to black doctors. They didn't want to see a white doctor. They wanted to go to the black doctor. White doctor would kill you. They went to black doctors. And so after the enslavement, throughout the country, there were all these doctors. They're black doctors. Sometimes people they call themselves pharmacists, but they were actually doctors. They were treating people and healing people and so forth. But then the American white corporate world got this idea that medicine should be controlled by white men. And so Abraham Flexner, remember that name, Flexner. You can look him up. Abraham Flexner was not a doctor. He was a researcher. He was hired and he was paid by the Rockefeller companies, Rockefellers, to assure that medicine be controlled by white males, not by these black doctors and not by these black women who were midwives. No, because that was where the medicine came from. The first person I knew in medicine was a woman who was a midwife for my mother. In fact, the woman who delivered me. So that was throughout the black community. Everywhere you had women who dealt with women, and you had medical people who knew herbs and roots. In fact, my grandfather was a root man. So this was a part of our tradition. So what Flexner did, he was the person who was responsible for creating what they call medical standards. So, in European, it's so clever. Create medical standards. So what I always call it, how you move the goalposts, right? So if you got so many people doing this, and so many black people healing people, and so many black people working people, say, now, wait a minute, and we don't control this thing? Let's see how we can control this. And so Flexner used a German model that had come from Germany that was used at Johns Hopkins. That's why Johns Hopkins is considered a major American research institution, because it was the first American university that had a graduate school. All of them were liberal arts and BAs and so on. But Johns Hopkins had a graduate school that was based on the German model of research, right? So he standardized medicine. And then what that meant was, in order to practice medicine, you got to have a college degree. You got to have a college degree. You can't just practice medicine. You got to have a college degree. So that's just to get into medicine. You got to have a college degree. But beyond that, you have to also go to medical school. So now, black people who were doctors, and we had some famous doctors in the African American community. You see, people who trained and who worked and studied hard. It was just like the law, the legal profession was the same way. Abraham Lincoln didn't go to law school, but he was a lawyer. You see, so that's the way it was until Flexner created this thing that allowed the United States to close down all the black medical schools except two. And those two black medical schools were Meharry and Howard University medical schools. All of the everything else was closed down. And white gynecologists, white male gynecologists, took over from black midwives to control women's reproduction. These are historical facts. There's a book by Deidre Owens, Owens, called Medical Bondage. And what she describes is the experimental work that early white American gynecologists did on black women. And Dr. James Sims, who's called the father of modern gynecology, began in 1844 performing experiments without anesthesia on enslaved women in Alabama. And then, in fact, she writes about three of these women, Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. And you know what happened? And think about this. In order to do these experiments, these women were enslaved. He leased them from their plantations for the purpose of gynecological experimentation. And he did 30 operations on one of the sisters, Anarcha. And he was considered during his time the leading gynecologist in America. He became president of the American Gynecology Association. And I'm telling you this because otherwise we don't even understand how people attempt to depopulate us and to depopulate the African American community. Fred Gray, you may know this name. If you don't, you should. We should all know his name. Fred Gray is a legend. He's a legal legend, and I'm just happy to say I've known him for a long time because he's the most famous graduate of my high school, and Fred Gray was Martin Luther King Jr.'s lawyer, and Fred Gray was an attorney at the age of 24 when he met Martin Luther King Jr. at the age of 26. This is, again, we talk about youth. I was talking earlier about Kwame Ture, Fred Hampton being so young, 19, 20 years old, when they were leading movements. Well, Fred Gray was an attorney at 24. He was Martin Luther King's and the Montgomery bus boycott attorney at the age of 24. King was 26. These were young brothers in Alabama. And I mean, one of the most racist states with the greatest hatred of black people, where you had vicious KKK people bombing churches and stuff. These young brothers, 24 and 26, led that movement. But Gray later wrote a book called The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, an insider's account of the shocking medical experiment conducted by government doctors against African American men. I'm telling you, this almost every sector of the society, whether you study economics, whether you study insurance, welfare, housing, medicine, you will find an attack on African people. And racist societies do that. Because their fear is competition. Number one, that's the big fear, competition of African people. And this is why for so long you couldn't even have black people playing baseball. You get baseball, just playing a game of baseball. I know young people don't realize this. No, black people can't play baseball. And then, okay, you can play baseball, but you can't be a pitcher. Because to be a pitcher, you can't do that. Or you can play football, but you can't be a quarterback. Because you can't have black people telling white people what to do. That's the ignorance that we have to deal with. So now I'm going to come to my conclusion so you know what the real deal is about this thing. Here's the real deal. The real deal about this population, even though we know that Lagos, Nigeria, is the largest city in the world now by population, with 28 million people living in Lagos. We know that's the size. That's New York can't make the claim it's the biggest city in the world. It's been a long time since New York has been able to make that claim, because you've had Tokyo, and you've had Sao Paulo, Mexico City, and you've had Shanghai, and many other cities that are much larger, right? And Lagos now is it's the capital of the world in terms of population. So what is the problem with population? Here's the problem. The problem is consumption. Consumption. Here's what I mean. Americans are 5% of the population of the world. 5%. But consume more than 25% of most of the resources in the world. They're only 5% of the world's population. We control, Americans control.
Wait. Will, what you doing?
Americans control, let me just see if I can mute that. No, I'm very sorry. Okay. Just 1 minute. I'm sorry. Okay, I think we got it now. All right. So Americans control. Yeah, Americans control consume 24 or 25% of the world's resources. You know, 5% of the nation. Americans really have the highest intake in the world of calories, of sugar, of fats. And it turns out that the average person worldwide uses, and I'm gonna put this in American terms, 7 acres per year. The average person uses 7 acres of resources a year. If you're talking about, you know, wheat and rice, and the average person may use 7 acres. The American use 17 acres. Average American. Now you can imagine if other people live like Americans, it would be a catastrophe. In fact, if other people live like Americans, we would need 4 Earths, not just 1 Earth, 4 Earths, in order to sustain everyone living like an American. So the problem is not the number of people. The problem has always been the idea of who will control resources and what resources will Europeans have that they will have to themselves and will not be able to share and not share with other people. So the less numbers of people you have, then the more consumption you will have in the American society. So basically, that's the point that I wanted to make in my conversation, because it's really about consumption. It is not about the numbers. I mean, as I told you at the beginning, we could put all the people on the earth, 8 billion of them, we could put them all in the state of Texas, we could put them all in the country of South Africa, and you have no problem. The problem we have is that Americans and Europeans consume much more of the resources of the earth than they need to in order for us to have an equitable distribution of wealth and resources. And I want to thank you for that. And now I'm going to see if there are any questions or comments, and I can unmute most of them. Okay. Are there questions? Are there any questions, comments? Okay.
Oh,
I don't.
I have a question.
All right. Who has this question? Who is speaking? Who is speaking?
Oh, I wanted to know the name of the person who wrote the book. And what was the book? The medical.
Bundle. Yeah, Dedra.
Yes.
Owens. Dedra. Deerdre. Dedra Owens. Owens.
Thank you.
All right. So,
excellent presentation.
Well, I thank you very much, and I will see all of you next week. Okay. Yes, Diane. Diane, go ahead.
Where is that?
Here. My question is that
Okay, who's speaking?
every American isn't consuming the great resource. How to get it down to who is and how can we, in general, are not consuming all that? Are they, since we have poor people and hungry people and everything else?
that is.
Understand what I'm
I know
asking?
what this is.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Okay. If you let her ask her question once again. Is this Tanya? Who is it?
This is Diane.
Diane. Okay, Diane. Go ahead. Say it again.
I was saying, since every American is not consuming
Yes,
great
yes.
resource. How can we get down to making things more fair and stopping the overuse of resources?
That's a very good point. I think it's a very good question too, because it's clearly every American is not consuming 17 acres of resources,
Right.
you know, and some people not consuming 1 acre of resources. So what you have the people who are hyper rich to the degree that we have no conception. We have no under. We cannot even understand how it is that somebody could make $100 million a year. 100 million a year. What I mean, I can't. And then there's some who make 1 billion a year. What do you do with that? How many planes and cars and how you what we have to do, we have to start talking about a moral and ethical redistribution. We really have to do that because we see it. I see it in my neighborhood. You have people who are homeless, sleeping on the street, you know. So how do we manage this? We've got to figure out somehow to manage this. And then even with that, even with those homeless, you still have the even with that you still have even with that you still have the even with that you still have the Americans who are still uh, uh, 7, 8, 9 times in terms of consumption, consuming more than the rest of the people on the earth. So even our poverty, even the people we consider to be poor, they say you're poor if you have 4 people in your family and you make $32,000 a year, you're poor. Well, all that's relative. If you live in Bangladesh, it's relative. If you live in Botswana, so it really is something that has to be worked out. And I think that part of it is that this notion of consumption has a lot to do also with the arrogance of race. The idea of I'll put it this way. One of the great teachers I had, he was not my teacher formally, but he was a professor of sociology at Canisius College in Buffalo, New York, when I lived in Buffalo. And his name was Dr. Nash. We all call him Dr. Nash. And I would meet him sometimes. I was a professor, young professor at the time. And he would say to me, he says, you know what I've learned being in this university, which was a white university, Canisius. He said, I've learned that white people, they operate on the basis of one thing, and that is who shall eat and how much shall they eat. And he says, that's what they do when they make decisions about hiring people. That's what they do when they make decisions about who is considered valuable and who is not. They make decisions about who shall have the resources of the earth. And that's an economic issue. But it's also a moral issue. Because if you treat all human beings and as humanity, then fundamentally you don't make these distinctions like that, you see? You don't make distinctions of gender, class, creed, color, texture of hair, nothing like that. They're human beings. This is a human. Otherwise, you make the decision that the South Africans made under apartheid. We cannot pay a black worker the same amount of money as we pay a white worker doing the same job. We got to pay the white worker more. We cannot pay a woman as much as we are paying a man. We've got to pay the man more. You can't if you make judgments like that, those immoral, unethical judgments, then you keep creating the poor distribution of wealth and resources on the earth. And this false issue of overpopulation will really only be in nothing but consumption. Who shall consume? Who's going to be able to, you know, to build a big mansion on the beach and that kind of thing, and use all the resources, all the water, all the energy, and so forth, and who's not going to be able to do it. Okay, so I think that's it, and I want to thank you for attending. I appreciate all of you. We had 88 people originally, so thank you, and we'll see you next week. All right, thank you. Bye bye.